morning. My name is Hashim Sarkis, Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the next round of speakers who will be focusing on the intersections of learning and computation. One of the first things I learned when I came to MIT 4 years ago is that at MIT we use the word learning much more often than education. At MIT we learn, we don't educate. We learn from each other, we learn from our students, we learn from the machines that we make that in turn learn from us. And in all this we learn by doing. This pedagogical approach underpins the seal of MIT, Mens et Manus, and its mission to use science and technology to advance society. Motto and mission mirror each other. In 1896, pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, the man who himself coined the phrase learning by doing, founded a famous school in Chicago called the Lab School, on the premise that we could bring scientific method to bear on education. Learning, like scientific exploration, should advance through real-life experimentation, not by rote. When carefully examined, lessons from life can become lessons from school. Dewey extended his use of scientific method from education to other aspects of life. For example, he advocated using scientific method to the solution of social problems. This approach he called democracy. Remarkably, his embrace of scientific method in pedagogy led him to also embrace its corollary, human imagination. Learning by doing involves action. Action generates uncertainties to which we have to respond, and in such uncertainties, it is our imagination that helps us relate the outcomes of our past experiments to anticipate future ones. Every great advance in science, Dewey observed, has issued from a new audacity of the imagination. Dewey worked very hard to integrate imagination and scientific method in learning, but for many reasons, these two attributes have been increasingly severed from each other over time. Dewey was writing in 1929, at the beginning of the second machine age and the Great Depression, when new machines were robbing people from their jobs and where their mechanical jobs and rote education were in turn robbing them from their ability to exercise their imagination and to deal with emerging uncertainties. I don't know which machine age we are at now, but we certainly live in an age of uncertainty. We are creating new machines that are threatening our jobs, our imagination, and our democracies like never before. It is precisely in our commitment to learning about these new machines by founding the Schwarzman College of Computing that we need to invest in cultivating the human imagination. After all, this is where the new jobs will always be after the old jobs are taken over by the new machines. Yesterday, I learned that Dan Hottenlocker, the first dean of the College of Computing, had studied at John Dewey's lab school in Chicago. It bodes very well. Those of you who know Dan have seen the work that he has done at Cornell, bringing design and creativity into science and technology. Dan, welcome back to MIT, the perpetual lab school, where we thrive on uncertainty, where science is the eternal method, and where, with your help, imagination will become the next endless frontier. Thank you very much.
It's an honor to be included in this celebration of the MIT Stephen A. Schwartz College of Computing. I'm going to talk today not about computing per se. I'm going to talk about why in life science and healthcare we need computing and computation and technology. As many of you know, I'm a member of the Department of Biology, which is not a part of the Institute that has traditionally been associated with computing and artificial intelligence. However, this is changing rapidly, and the interface represents an exciting, and perhaps the most exciting, part of the future of biological science. For example, MIT has recently launched a new exciting J clinic focused on machine learning and healthcare. There will also be this summer in this building a Koch Institute symposium on machine learning and cancer. But before focusing on this interface of cancer and machine learning and computing, let me talk a moment about the history of biomedical research at MIT and why it needs transformation by the Schwarzman College of Computing. When I arrived at MIT in 1974 in the newly opened Center for Cancer Research, I discovered a computer in the corner of the laboratory of Dave Baltimore. But in the next 10 years, I do not think it was ever touched. Many experiments were underway, and research discoveries were recognized by 4 Nobel Prizes, but not one involved a computer. In a related story that Eric Lander told me, when the Whitehead was being designed, there was not a room or space set aside for a computer, until Eric suggested that it might be useful at some stage in the future to have a computer in the building. All of this changed in the 1990s with the commencement of the Human Genome Initiative. The genome was completed in 2003, cost $3 billion, and brought biomedical science into the IT and computer age. The MIT community led this genomic transformation, as it also led the development of biotechnology in the 1970s. We're now in the age of biotechnology, particularly here in Kendall Square, with the most concentrated biomedical research community in the world. What is shown here on this slide is MIT in the red buildings along the Charles, and then the light blue buildings occupied by biotechnology research labs with greater than 50 employees. There are probably another 100 companies located in this space that are smaller than that. This community has been labeled the most innovative square mile on Earth. The products of Kendall Square are improving the lives of patients with genetic diseases, sort of spinal muscular atrophy, for an example, as well as cancer. Amazing as this complex is today, biotechnology and all of life science, in my opinion, will be transformed by artificial intelligence and machine learning. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, IBM, and others are all locating research facilities in and around Kendall Square with a primary focus on healthcare. We need their expertise and market power to flourish, but MIT and the Schwarzman College will be an essential part of making the transformation. A significant challenge to the future of this innovation is the growing cost of healthcare. The red dashed line on this graph is the percent increase in the cost of medical care from 1980 to 2010. It has increased real purchasing power 2.5-fold. Note that the dashed line just below that is the increase in purchasing power of the top 5% wage earners in this country. And the lines below that represent the percent increase in income of other lower wage earners. Clearly, this separation in the cost of health care from the purchasing powers of families cannot continue. We as a nation are spending 18 to 19% of the GDP on health care, and greater costs will have really significant economic impact and social impact. Proprietary pharmaceuticals, such as patent drugs, accounted for about 12% of the cost of healthcare in 1980, and it accounts for about 12% in 2010. So this has been part of the increase in healthcare, but it does not account for a major part of the increase in cost of healthcare in this country. The cost of every segment of healthcare has increased. Physician time, hospital beds, record keeping, reimbursement, etc. We need an across the board increase in the productivity of healthcare, better quality healthcare per dollar of cost. High tech and computing has delivered this transformation in every sector of society except in healthcare. Hopefully, the incorporation of new technologies such as these will reduce this rate of growth in cost while sustaining increased quality. The promise of the addition of data and IT extends across the board, from genomic data to access to patient behavior and patient environments. We're in the process of collecting genomic data showing the inherent risk of many diseases. It now costs $300 to sequence a human genome, not $3 billion for the first genome. Medical records, lifestyle data will reveal early signs of illness, pathology, blood assays, imaging, all with artificial intelligence and machine learning will precisely diagnose an illness at early onset. The integration of these data will also be the basis for prescribing treatment paradigms, when to treat, how to treat, and when not to treat. This is the heart of what is described as precision medicine, and the same innovation, same information will drive discovery in medical research. When you know where to look, discoveries are very likely to follow. The above data will have to be shared with physicians and patients, respecting their privacy in trustworthy ways, in ways that's understandable by both physicians and patients. All of this depends on new technology. Having employees and patients and citizens trained are aware in biomedical science and computer science, and being able to create new algorithms that seem mysterious to me sometimes. One outcome of this transformation is improvement in diagnosis of early disease. The impact of this will be astounding. I use here the example of the terrible disease of pancreatic cancer. If you diagnose pancreatic cancer at stage 1 or 2, a patient has a 55% chance of 5-year survival. And these odds are improving as we improve our treatments. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg exemplifies this. If the diagnosis happens at stage 3 or 4, where 80% of all patients are diagnosed, the chances of 5-year survival falls to less than 5%. Unfortunately, Patrick Swayze is an example. Thus, advancing control of cancer is best approached by devising means for diagnosing it early, improving treatment at this stage for cures, and an essential part of this is the integration of patient data to predict risk, developing better imaging technology to identify the cancer before it gets large enough to spread, and that's machine learning, as you will hear today. My sincere expectation is that MIT has taken a strong lead in this space through the establishment of the Schwarzman College of Computing. its research and educational effort will accelerate the transformation of healthcare and healthcare research to the benefit of patients around the world. We sincerely need this college. I am so excited to be part of this celebration. I thank Mr. Schwarzman and the family and MIT for the vision to launch the Schwarzman College of Computing. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. It's a very exciting time for MIT, and I'm really glad to be part of it. Computing is making inroads to every academic discipline. It's redefining disciplines, creating very exciting intersections. And one such intersection is computation and economics, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So, as we're all experiencing, advances in computing are transforming myriad marketplaces. Instead of the brick-and-mortar marketplaces that we're all used to, we now have online markets, which not just act as platforms for bringing many more people together, but also they offer a wide array of new goods and services. The challenge is that for these marketplaces to work, we need not just better technology, better hardware, software, algorithms, but we also need the design of economic incentives to move in tandem. And I'll try to make this point by providing two examples to you. One of the iconic examples of digital markets is online advertising markets. Two of the top technology companies, Google and Facebook, owe virtually all of their revenue to their ability to monetize their platforms through advertising. The chart here shows the advertising revenue of Google over time since 2001. It has reached in 2018 about 117 billion US dollars, amounting for 72% of the revenue of the company. Much of this revenue comes from what we call the sponsored search auctions. So when you enter a search keyword into a search engine, and in this case, for some reason, we entered used cars in Bristol, it results in a page like this, which comprises a list of organic search results that you see in the bottom. These are results that are related to your keyword and basically ordered in order of relevance by some underlying algorithms, such as PageRank, but also a list of sponsored links that you see here in the red boxes, paid by advertisers. Each time you enter a keyword into the search engine, an auction is run in real time in order to decide which advertisers' links will be shown. In what order? How much are they going to be charged? Think about it, in real time. That's a lot of auctions. And how do these auctions work? Advertisers, let's say in this example, some car dealer in Bristol, submits bids for keywords, let's say used cars, and says, I'm going to pay per click. I'm going to pay $1 if any user clicks on my link. So, and then the way these links are allocated is in the order of the bids that are submitted. The highest bid gets the top slots because they're more valuable. Why? Because users scan the page from top to bottom. So how do the payments get done? I just said $1, right? Very small amounts. And from these very small amounts, basically emerged a very huge industry, as highlighted by the chief economist of Google, Hal Varian. Most people don't realize that all that money comes pennies at a time. So let's now look at how these small amounts are made. Sponsored search started in mid-90s with the so-called first price auction. And this is basically bidders exactly pay what they bid in the scheme that I just told you about. A drawback was quickly discovered. Why? Because if you pay what you bid, you say you're going to pay $1 and you pay $1. What happens is if you lose, if you do not win, you have an incentive to keep increasing your bid. And if you win, you have an incentive to shave off your bid next time. And this was actually observed very clearly in data. led to very unstable price dynamics with huge revenue consequences. So instead, in 2002, Google deployed a system which was inspired by the so-called second price auction, in which the bidders pay the second highest bid instead of what they bid here. And let me show you how the second price auction works. This is a very simple example. We have 3 links to allocate, and the 3 highest bidders will get those links. In this case, $10, $4, and $2 bidders. And let's see what they're going to pay. The highest guy will pay the second highest bid, which is $4. The second one will pay $2. The next one will pay $1. This is basically what we mean by a generalized second price auction exactly deployed by Google. You immediately see a problem. If actually the top guy bids $3 instead, he still gets a slot, the second one, in this case, but then he pays the second highest price, which is $2, instead of the $4, so he increases his payoff. So that means that he has an incentive, actually, to game the system. This is the problem with the generalized second price auction. It's open to manipulation, another form of instability. I hope that these examples highlighted the costs of not getting incentives right. We need not just better technology, but also better incentives. And in fact, many companies are now moving towards designing much more sophisticated, incentive-compatible, fast, scalable auction design. Let me turn to another marketplace, a much bigger marketplace, finance. Finance is as old as humanity, but in the modern economy, it's done not through money lenders, but very high-tech banks and computerized platforms. What that means is a huge increase in interconnections. Basically, the exposure of many of the global banks to each other's assets and liabilities skyrocketed over the past several decades, and actually reaching an all-time high before the global financial crisis of 2008. Accompanying this is also a huge rise in the complex financial products, such as derivatives contracts. So interconnections are good. They enable you to do risk sharing, better matching of demands to funds, but at the same time also has unintended consequences because they act as conduits for spreading the financial distress, as the world found out in 2008. So more interconnections are more dominoes exposed to each other. And actually, research shows that the extent of the spread of distress very much depends on the underlying connections between these financial institutions, size of the shocks, and the incentives of these financial institutions to insure themselves against this financial distress. Technology not only enables us to design better marketplaces, but also trading. Enormous amount of resources are placed into fast algorithmic trades in order to beat the market by a few milliseconds. But of course, this doesn't mean that it will lead to efficient allocation of resources, and actually may be a very big source of instability again because of false probing bids, as well as very much out of control feedback effects. In fact, one of the biggest crashes of the stock market was the flash crash of 2010, which was caused by miscalibrated algorithmic trading. So again, this is another example where we see that we have to design technology together with these incentives. This takes the form of policy and regulations here in order to counteract these systemic crashes due to interconnections, complex financial products, as well as algorithmic trading. So all of this technology and all of these developments provide great opportunities for us, but it could also very much backfire if we don't design these systems with a proper understanding of both computation and economics. And that was one of the incentives for us to design a completely new major at MIT. Computer science, economics, and data science, which is a true collaboration between departments of economics and ECS. Our goal is to educate the next generation of students who are equipped with the foundational knowledge to address these exciting problems. The Schwarzman College will be a great enabler for us to be able to realize our dream. So thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. How are you guys doing today? My name is Sarah Williams. I am a professor of technology and urban planning. but I'm so much more. I'm trained as a geographer, an architect, an urban planner, and a data scientist. And I combine these skills to really create data for action. And at the heart of data action is the idea that we need to build expert teams to work together to really capture the insights of data. And I believe this kind of collaborative learning is what really allows us to make data work for civic change. So because I like to tell stories with data, I'm going to tell you a story today. My story starts in Nairobi, Kenya. I've done a lot of work in Nairobi. This is a typical scene on the street. Nairobi suffers from severe congestion problems. This is similar in many rapidly developing cities. As a transportation planner, one of the things that we use to address this issue is transportation models. But we need data to make those models, and many cities, especially rapidly developing cities, don't have that data. I applied my skills in machine learning to extract roadways for the Nairobi metropolitan area, creating the first GIS data set which allowed us to make this transportation model. And while my model was successful, one of the issues is we didn't have data on the matatus. Matatus are the main way people get around in Nairobi. And people really depend on this almost like they depend on a public transit system. If you don't know what a matatu is, I'm going to show you a small clip. Imagine riding in this.
If you wouldn't know better, you could be in a club or a bar, but you're not. You're in a minibus driving through Nairobi. And with volumes like this, you'd better not come on an empty stomach. On the outside, they're painted in hot designs. And their name matatu is derived from the Kiswahili words for 3 cents for a ride, which nowadays is more like 30 cents. The fares are raised by the conductors. Traveling by matatu is a daily reality for millions of Kenyans.
So if you want to get around on a matatu, you ask your matatu driver. And right before we did our research in Nairobi, the main way you understood how to get around is just this informal talking with the drivers who, as you can see, really pride themselves in the designs of their vehicles, and it's really something that people in Nairobi talk about all the time. And so I thought, how could I create raw data for my model, but create data that everyone could use? If I didn't have an ability to find out where the matatus went, the average person in Nairobi didn't as well. So if you know Nairobi, you know people use their cell phone for everything. They use their cell phone to buy coffee. They even use their cell phone to buy a ride on the matatu. So we decided, how could we leverage this ubiquitous technology to collect data on this system, but open it up for anyone to use? We developed an application in coordination with the University of Nairobi, and this was so that we would provide context for the Nairobi metropolitan area, but also so that the technology we built would retain and remain in Nairobi. So long after we left, this work could be built upon. We collected the data in GTFS. How many people know what GTFS is? One. There's always one person. You probably all use GTFS today. It's what allows you to route yourself on Google Transit. So if you're using Google Transit, in the background is GTFS. I note this as importance because by making it in an open data format, it was instantly usable by a lot of different software companies. So not just Google. GTFS is a text file that has basically latitude and longitude points that gives us a schedule. And as we collected the data, it came streaming in, collecting the routes. But these routes were combined, hard to understand. How do we visualize it? How are we going to communicate this information? We ultimately decided to develop something that looks like a subway map that you might see in New York, London, Paris, even Boston. This map was developed in coordination, not just with our team in the University of Nairobi, but also the matatu drivers, owners, the government. And this is the idea that collaborating with data allows people to trust the results. And here you're seeing them actually noticing that there's a lot of missing routes in the top. They're instantly using our map to create new plans for the city. The maps went viral on the internet. We got them published in the paper so people who don't have cell phones could access the information. And what I like to talk about is how do you measure success on an open data project? And that's when other people leverage your data for their own change. So in Nairobi, I was really excited when the government invited us to a press conference and made the map an official map of the city. So while they were largely disinterested through the project, they felt that they could trust the data set, and now it's the official map for the city. Google has put the data into Google Transit. It's the first informal transit system navigable through Google Transit. The World Bank copied our visualization to get support for their BRT bus line. This is actually the World Bank's map of BRT, not our map. It looks very similar, doesn't it? There are now 5 apps in Nairobi that use our data as the base. Our collaborative process really helped us make relationships with Nairobi's strong technology community. And we have continued to teach classes, do research with that community. A recent class where we had a World Bank policy expert embedded in the class, collaborated with Ma3Route, which is a Waze-like app in Nairobi, to perform semantic analysis on text streams from Twitter to map where crashes were happening in real time in Nairobi, and that came from another class. So semi-formal transit provides mobility around the world, not just in Nairobi. The majority of countries have this kind of transit system. The work in Nairobi inspired Amman, Managua. In fact, 26 different cities have used our tools and have become part of our network in developing data sets and maps for their systems. This has caused us to create a global network for mapping transport data, where we can provide resources, connect people to the policy, but also help them scale their work, create continued involvement. We just launched the Africa Resource Center last August, Latin America in January. And I hope the work that I showed you today shows how a geographer, urban planner, architect, data scientist can teach the students of the next generation how to combine these schools to create civic change. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Vivienne Sze. I'm a faculty member in the ECS department, and I'm going to talk to you about energy-efficient AI. So today, most of the processing that's being done for AI happens in the cloud. But there's many compelling reasons why we want to move it out of the cloud into the edge and process it locally on your device. So the first thing is communication. So if we really want AI to be used by or accessible to many people across the world, we need to reduce the dependency on the communication infrastructure, so bring it directly to the person. We saw this morning also there's a lot of applications of AI in the healthcare space, so privacy is also really important in terms of the type of data that we're collecting. So again, maybe you want to keep the data on the actual local device to preserve privacy. And then finally, there's a lot of applications that involve interactions with the real world and where you don't want to have a slow response time. So a typical example of this would be self-driving cars. So imagine if your car is going very fast on the highway and you're trying to avoid a collision. You might not have time to send the data all the way to the cloud, wait for it to be processed, and then pushed back out to the car itself. Right? So latency is another reason why we want to do the processing at the edge. But there are challenges involving moving this computing to the edge itself, primarily power consumption. So for example, if we take the self-driving car as an example again, so self-driving cars consume over 1,000 or 2,000 watts for just the computing power to just crunch the data of all the sensors that it's collecting. So that's a challenge. And then if we think about moving this compute onto a smaller device, so let's say a handheld device like your phone or these smaller robots, the power challenges are even more stringent. So for example, on these small devices, you have very limited battery capacity because of the size and the weight of the device. So you can't have too much energy there. And then also, if we take a look at the existing embedded processors out there, currently they consume an order of magnitude more power than what is allowed on these handheld devices. So typically, on these handheld devices, you can only afford about a watt of computational power. So if we take a look, and if we think about how we have dealt with this over the past few decades, typically what we would do is we would just wait for Moore's law and Dennard scaling to give us faster, smaller, and more efficient transistors. But this trend has really slowed down over the past decade, so we need to think of something else. This is not going to be a solution that will carry us forward. So in our group, primarily what we've been looking at is how do we deliver energy-efficient AI through cross-layer design, all the way across the stack. So what does that mean? The first thing is we want to develop new algorithms that are energy efficient. So we really want to think about the energy consumption of the algorithm in addition to the accuracy of the algorithm, and how these algorithms might map onto hardware. The second thing we need to do is we need to build more specialized hardware and kind of redesign the computers from the ground up, really targeting AI. So this means new compute architectures and new circuits. And then finally, it's really important to kind of think about how this compute hardware would be integrated into an actual system. So both the sensing or actuation, if you're a robot, are also important. So you want a holistic solution in terms of reducing energy consumption. So now I'll tell you a little bit about a couple of the projects that we've been working on. So the first is we've worked on building efficient hardware for deep neural networks. So if you're familiar with deep neural nets, it's used for a wide range of AI applications today. It delivers state-of-the-art accuracy, so people are very excited about that. In terms of developing specialized hardware for it, what we actually really focused on was reducing the cost of data movement. So as it turns out, it's not really the computation, like doing the multiplies or adds, that's really expensive, but it's how you move the data from the memory to the compute engines, which is consuming a lot of energy. And so we really designed a specialized hardware named Iris that focuses on minimizing this data movement so we can drop the energy consumption. So as a result, we can do tasks like image classification, which is a core task in computer vision, in under 1/3 of a watt. And in the end, if you compare it to existing mobile GPUs, it's an order of magnitude lower in terms of energy consumption. OK, so then another project that we've been working on, this is in collaboration with Surtesh Karaman, who is a roboticist in the Aero-Astro department here at MIT. We've been looking at how do you do autonomous navigations for these very small drones, about the size of a quarter. In autonomous navigation, one of the key things that you have to do before you can actually navigate is figure out where you actually are in the world. So that's localization. So you can see here in the image, we're getting a video stream. And then on the most right-hand side, you can see we're trying to estimate the position in the 3D world. And that's the very first, this localization is the key step in autonomous navigation. And with this chip Navion that we developed together through the co-design of both the algorithms and the hardware, we're able to do this processing in under 1/10 of a watt, so around 24 milliwatts. And so where can this actually be used? Well, actually, there's a whole class of low-energy robotics out there which take less than a watt to do actuation. So for example, you can imagine these lighter-than-air vehicles that can be used for air quality monitoring, or miniature satellites that you could use for deep space exploration, or origami and foldable robots that you can use for medical applications. So all of these robots take very little energy to actuate and interact with the real world, and so it's really important that the computation is also very low power. Another example that I want to talk about is some work that I'm doing with Thomas Helt in the Institute of Medical Engineering and Sciences here at MIT. And really what we're focusing on is looking at the role of energy-efficient AI in the healthcare space. In particular, we're looking at the monitoring of the progression of neurodegenerative diseases, which currently affects more than 50 million people worldwide. One of the ways in which people are assessed for dementia, let's say, is that they have to go into the clinic and talk to a specialist. And they're asked a series of questions. And the issue with this is, first of all, it's very expensive to do this. It's very time-consuming, so people can only go maybe once or twice a year at most. And then third, it's often a very qualitative and subjective assessment. So for example, different specialists might have different conclusions in terms of their evaluation, and even the specialists themselves, the repeatability in terms of their testing might vary. What's been really exciting is that recently it's been shown that there is some correlation between eye movement and these types of diseases. And so if you can measure the eye movement will give you a much more quantitative evaluation of the state of the person's mind or the disease progression or regression. And this could be useful in terms of evaluating whether or not a drug is working. But again, the challenge right now with these eye movement assessments is they have to go into the clinic to do it. It takes really expensive cameras, and it's quite inconvenient. And so with Thomas, what we're looking at is whether or not we can integrate the eye movement tests onto a smartphone itself. So then you can bring it into the home. It will be very low cost, and you can do frequent measurements. And this would be a good complement to the specialist assessment. So in summary, and so also for this, it's really important to do the processing on the device, because obviously it's medical information. So in summary, I think energy-efficient AI is really important. It really allows AI to extend its reach beyond the cloud. What it enables us to do is you can reduce your reliance on the communication network. You can enable privacy. You have lower latency, and so you can use AI for a broad set of applications from robotics to healthcare. And in order to enable energy-efficient AI, what's really important is you need to have kind of cross-layer design from algorithms all the way down to specialized hardware. And to do that, by having specialized hardware, we really believe this will enable the progress of AI over the next decade or so. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Munther Dahleh. I'm a faculty member in EECS, also the faculty director of the Institute for Data Systems and Society. And today I want to make a few remarks about the economics of data. To put this whole thing in context, I think it's important to sort of summarize the evolution of computing. So if you think about it, back in the 50s and 60s, we relied on mainframes to do centralized heavy computing that allowed us to simulate very complex problems in terms of the weather phenomenon or transportation systems, energy systems, and so forth. Several decades later, I would say 80s and 90s, we started talking about mobile communication, and communication enabled distributing the computing across many agents, but allowed us to collect enormous amount of data about these agents. And now we're in an era where these mobile computing devices are embedded in physical systems where people not only are collecting data about their surroundings, but they're making decisions with respect to these surroundings. And that, for example, changed the way many infrastructures are operating. One example be the transportation systems, where obviously getting from bad to worse. Demand is increasing. We cannot supply more roads to deal with these demands. And so what we do, the only hope we have is to manage the information, to manage the data, incentivize people to do the right thing in order to minimize these kind of congestions. So there's a change in the paradigm in terms of research and education. When we used to think about physical systems and engineered systems on one side, and people and institutions on the other side. And now, because of this rapid computing and decision-making, these two worlds have connected, and research, in terms of understanding whether you're thinking about infrastructures, you're thinking about voting systems, you're thinking about healthcare, you have to think of these things in an integrated way. That Asu's 614 program is one that addresses this kind of a challenge, but also IDSS PhD program also is structured to enable the bilingual student to be able to think about those problems together in solving some of the societal challenges. And you can see that this sort of decision-making over data is exploding in terms of the number of papers, in terms of the funding that is going there, in terms of the revenue generated, and certainly the skill set that is needed from students is entirely around data. Whether it's actually processing the data, machine learning, AI, you name it, it's all about data. So if that data is so important, how do we begin to think of it as a commodity? How do we think about the value that data provides? And I like this quote that says that personal data is the new oil of the internet and the new currency of the digital world. If it's a currency, what is its value? And how do we quantify that? I have to say that many of the data companies are struggling today figuring out how to get customers, because customers are not clear on the value that the data provides. Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters use fear tactics to say, well, your competitor has bought this data, why don't you buy this data? We are very fearful of things like 23andMe providing our data to come back and bite us in the future in terms of insurances and God knows what if your data turns out to have something that is not desirable. We cannot yet figure out the impact of Cambridge Analytica or, for example, the 150 million financial data sets that has been made public by the Equifax breach. How do we quantify this kind of a breach? We still have a hard time understanding this. So we need a marketplace, a place where we discover the value of data. And Asu saved me a minute because she described the whole ad market. I don't know how many of you would have imagined that we have over $200 to $300 billion market in advertisement 30 years ago. I think all of us would think this is insane. The most interesting thing about the advertisement market is that it's entirely predicated on your data. At the same time, you are not part of that market. And you do not have a choice of how your data is being processed in that market. And what we want to do is bring that privacy back to the consumer, retain that choice to the user. Creating a market in which the data value is discovered is going to be beneficial in many applications. Transportation, energy, the future of the integration of all the electrified cars into the market and understanding the processing of all the storage that we have. Logistics, fraud data, and what have you. It's an amazing sort of space that will allow this sharing of data. A few bullets to tell you that this problem is challenging. We like to work on challenging problems. It's challenging because data is not a real commodity. It's a digital good. It has zero marginal cost for replication. It's very difficult to authenticate. If a buyer comes in to buy data, they have no idea what they're buying. Typically, a buyer should come in to buy some value. They want to do something with the data, not to buy data. How does a market match the two together and keep the privacy of the different data distributors? How do you authenticate the data? And finally, how do you deal with externality? Because if I sell my data to two different competing companies, the value of my data drops. Not only we're working on understanding the mathematics that go with this, which require economics, algorithmic game theory, optimization, machine learning, and a lot of information theory, but also we're trying to apply it in places where it matters. One project that I will tell you that an IDSS that we're taking on is empowering farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. The problem that farmers right now, they are very worried about getting credit to upgrade their operations because they're poor and they worry about mortgaging their land. What we want to do by creating a data market, a sharing market between farmers, is to be able to extrapolate the value of introducing technology in the gain that they can have so that they can go and negotiate better terms with these creditors. We're setting up this whole ecosystem around this platform for data. My feeling is that creating these kind of platforms where data is shared incentivizes people to contribute good data because they can retain the value themselves, but also can benefit from everybody else's, and allows us to address critical and societal challenges. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Over the last few months, a number of organizations and conferences have marked the 10th anniversary of the worst financial crisis in our lifetimes. And in the aftermath of that crisis, we passed the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, a sweeping piece of legislation that completely reconfigured the landscape of regulations in the financial ecosystem. This act was 2,319 pages long, contained hundreds of new rules and regulations, thousands of conditions and exceptions, And it was written by many authors, a number of whom had no idea what the others were doing. It's just too complex for any one person to comprehend. And as a financial economist interested in regulation, I really had a hard time making heads or tails of it. Did the financial reforms deal with the issues of the financial crisis? Or do we go too far, or maybe not enough? What do these questions have to do with computing? Well, computer scientists and engineers understand complexity deeply. For example, the Google search engine, or the Linux operating system, or the Mozilla Firefox search engine are all examples of complex rules and regulations that contain hundreds of various different laws, thousands of conditions and exceptions, and were written in many cases by authors working entirely independently. What if we use the principles of good software design to analyze the financial regulations? What would we learn from that process? Well, in order to tell you about that, it's not as crazy an idea as you might think, because after all, the laws of the land are in fact the operating system of our society. So, if you take a look at all of the laws of the US Code, you print them out, it would be many volumes on a law school library shelf. But the fact is that for over the past 80 years, if you took the annual versions of the entire US legal code, they would actually fit on a thumb drive. Not really that big a data set at all. In fact, the 2014 vintage of the US legal code is over 200,000 pages long, but it's only 1.8 million sentences, about 41.4 million words. And that actually compares pretty favorably with the kind of complex code that computer scientists and engineers use all the time. So let me tell you a little bit about the legal code. First of all, like most pieces of complex software, it's actually divided up into discrete units called titles. The current US legal code has 53 titles, such as Title 12, banks and banking. That's the part of the US legal code that's most relevant for financial regulation. Title 26 is the Internal Revenue Code, something we'll all be dealing with in a couple of months. Title 35 is the patent system, and so on and so forth. And each of these titles is divided up into even smaller sections. Now, is this collection of titles and sections well designed? Well, if you talk to computer scientists and engineers about what makes a good piece of software, and I've done this, a number of my colleagues here in this room have helped out with this, they point to the following, the 5 C's of software development: conciseness, cohesion, change, coupling, and complexity. In the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on one of these, coupling. Coupling is an idea that has to do with how different parts of a complex piece of software interconnect. And the best way to understand it is through a pretty simple example. Imagine you have a piece of software that's comprised of different discrete components labeled A, B, C, all the way through I, each of which engages in certain kinds of computations based upon inputs that it takes in and outputs that it provides. And the arrows between these different components indicate whether or not there are any interdependencies. For example, the arrow between A and B indicates that B calls or references A. And the reason the arrow goes from A to B is that if you make a change in A, that could affect the proper operation of B. So when you make changes in A, you better go check to see what's happening with B. Now, once you define these nodes and arrows, you can actually define subsets of these nodes that have special properties. And one way to do that is using the property of strong connectedness. A strongly connected subset of nodes has a property that you can go from each node to any other node in that subset by following a particular path of arrows. They're all connected, sort of like the New York subway system. So, as an example, in this particular graph, nodes B and E are a strongly connected subset because you can go from B to E and E to B. Notice that A is not part of that subset. Because while you can get from A to B and A to E, there is no way to get from B to A or E to A, sort of like the Boston subway system. Or as they say in Maine, you can't get there from here. Now, once you define all of these strongly connected subsets, as I have here, you can then come up with a measure for how efficient this code is. What you do is you look at the largest strongly connected subset, in this case, D, G, F, and H, which we call the core. And you ask the question, how big is the core? Because the bigger the core, the more difficult it is to manage this code. Why? Because by definition, the core is a strongly connected subset, so any change you make in any part of that core, you need to worry about what it's going to do to every other element in that set. And so by that measure, this is a pretty badly written piece of code because the core is 44% of the total number of pieces of code. By comparison, if you look at Firefox, across the versions 1 through 20, the median size of the core is only 23%. Now, across the 53 titles of the US legal code, there are 36,670 discrete sections. And if we treat each section as a node, and we look at cross-references from one section to the other as the arrows, we can actually calculate the core of the legal code. What is that? It turns out that the core is 6,947 sections, or 19%, which is pretty good, except for the fact that not all parts of the legal code are created equal. And let me give you a few examples. In 2009, US Congress passed the Omnibus Appropriations Act, which is basically a list of appropriations for various line items. Very, very simple piece of legislation, not a lot of interdependencies. So when we develop a graph of those interconnections, we see that it's actually pretty straightforward. The nodes that are colored red are the core. And you can see that the core is a really small part of the overall set. Now, the US patent system, Title 35, is quite a bit more complicated. Many more interconnections, not surprisingly, but actually, when you look at the core, it's still a pretty small part of the overall system. Now, what about Title 12, banks and banking, the part that interests me the most as a financial economist? Yeah. This is a problem. Highly complex with interdependencies that most people couldn't even begin to calculate. But that's not the worst. Title 26, the Internal Revenue Code. Talk about your spaghetti code. We really need tax reform sooner rather than later. Using this and other measures, we actually can analyze the legal code to understand whether or not it's well written or whether there are going to be problems that arise. And in a paper that I wrote with some students and a practicing attorney, we developed these ideas and applied it to the legal code, and we published it in a law journal. At the time we started our research, the complexity of financial regulation and design was not a subject that involved computing. Now it is. This is why we need the Schwarzman College of Computing. And I want to join my MIT colleagues in thanking Mr. Schwarzman and his family for this transformative gift. And I want to congratulate and thank Dean Huttenlocher for taking on this incredibly exciting challenge and opportunity to launch the college. Thank you.